Last episode, we dealt with the Cold War, but today, we will take a deeper dive into the communist world, focusing on the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. After the Second World War, the Soviets emerged as one of the world's superpowers, alongside the United States. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's reputation as a war hero and the leader of the victorious Soviet Union was solidified after the war. Though most countries credited the Soviets with being the most decisive factor in the victory in Europe, they were dealt the heaviest blow, with over 8 million military deaths and nearly 20 million civilian. With the loss of so many men, women had to step up to perform the heavy industrial and manual labor. The Red Army's role in defeating Germany established the Soviet Union as a global superpower, but the country suffered enormous casualties and devastation. And much of Western Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus was left in ruins. The Soviet Union faced a monumental task of rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, which had been severely damaged during the war. Under Stalin's leadership, the state initiated efforts to reconstruct industry, rebuild cities, and restore agricultural production. This was done through the fourth and fifth five-year plans, which focused on rapid reconstruction of industry and infrastructure. The plan prioritized heavy industry and military production, with less attention given to consumer goods and living standards. While the Soviet Union managed to recover industrially by the early 1950s, the plan put a significant burden on the population, which continued to experience food shortages and housing crises. But though the Nazi menace was defeated, the emergence of the Cold War continued to feed the Soviet leaders' paranoia. In 1946, Stalin introduced the Zhdanov Doctrine, named after Andrei Zhdanov, a key Stalinist ideologue. The doctrine mandated strict control over art, culture, and intellectual life, insisting that all cultural output serve the goals of the communist state. Western influences were condemned as corrupt and bourgeois. Writers, artists, and intellectuals were expected to conform to socialist realism, and those who deviated were censored, blacklisted, or imprisoned. Socialist realism aimed to portray an idealized version of Soviet life, showing happy, hard-working citizens, soldiers, and leaders contributing to the collective progress of the state. Celebrating the victory of the Soviet Union in World War II, the heroism of the Red Army, and the ongoing industrial and agricultural progress were common themes. The emphasis was on the collective good rather than individualism. Once the dust was settled, Stalin conducted another series of purges. These post-war purges were less extensive than the Great Purge of the 1930s, but were nonetheless significant. The Leningrad Affair was one of Stalin's major post-war purges, targeting leaders in the former capital of Leningrad, whom Stalin viewed as too independent. Several high-ranking officials were arrested, tried, and executed on fabricated charges of treason. Various ethnic groups such as Chechens, Tatars, and Volga Germans were forcibly resettled in Siberia and Central Asia, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. In 1948, the Soviet Union supported the establishment of Israel, hoping it would be a socialist ally in the Middle East. But with the rise of Cold War divisions, Israel's alignment with Western nations made Stalin wary. It fueled fears that Soviet Jews might have dual loyalties, and the Man of Steel hardened his suspicions. Many intellectuals, artists, and scientists were deemed what were called rootless cosmopolitans, lacking in national loyalty, and were persecuted. The JAC, or Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, was established during World War II to garner international support against Nazi Germany, especially from Western countries. But after the war, Stalin grew suspicious of their ties to the United States and Israel. In 1952, 13 members were executed in what became known as the Night of the Murdered Poets. Even Foreign Minister Molotov, who had been loyal to Stalin for many years even before he took power, wasn't entirely safe, as Stalin expelled his Jewish wife to a Siberian concentration camp. In 1952, Stalin orchestrated the Doctors' Plot, accusing Jewish doctors of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders through medical treatments. Many doctors were arrested and tortured to extract confessions, and plans were reportedly underway for mass deportations of Jews to remote regions. But these never came to pass because of a pivotal turn of events. In March 1953, Stalin died of a stroke. Many still believe him to have been poisoned. He left behind no clear successor, creating a leadership vacuum. Stalin had been the supreme leader for nearly 3 decades, and his death unleashed a struggle among his top lieutenants. Initially seen as Stalin's natural successor, Georgy Malenkov was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers, or Premier, effectively making him the head of government. At the time of Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev was a key member of the Politburo and the Central Committee. He would also emerge as a major player in the power struggle. Stalin's notorious chief of the secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, was one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union. His history of terror made him a target for Khrushchev and other party members, who feared a return to Stalinist purges. Khrushchev masterminded a plot to eliminate Beria, and with the backing of Malenkov and the military, accused him of treason and espionage. After a secret trial, Beria was found guilty and executed in December. To outmaneuver Malenkov, Khrushchev steadily built up his control over the Communist Party. He positioned himself as the defender of socialist ideology, emphasizing heavy industry and agricultural reforms that were more in line with Soviet priorities. Malenkov, who instead favored reducing defense spending and increasing consumer good production, made him increasingly popular with the people, but not with leadership, and he was forced to step down from the premiership and replaced with a Khrushchev ally. Once Khrushchev became leader, he did what any politician would do, and completely reversed his opinions. With Malenkov out of the way, Khrushchev adopted reformist policies, allowing partial decentralization and better relations with the West, what was called peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev introduced reforms to decentralize economic decision-making, aiming to improve efficiency by transferring some control to a regional economic council, known as Sovnarkos. This was meant to reduce the inefficiencies of the centralized system. One of Khrushchev's boldest economic initiatives was the Virgin Lands campaign, which aimed to boost agricultural production by cultivating unused land in Kazakhstan and Siberia. Initially, the program was successful in increasing grain production, but over time, it faced environmental challenges like soil degradation, and ultimately fell short of its ambitious goals. His policies remained inconsistent, and many of his agricultural initiatives, including an overemphasis on corn, failed due to poor planning and mismanagement. Khrushchev did realize the strategic value of space exploration as a tool for demonstrating the technological superiority of communism. In October 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into space. The successful launch marked the beginning of the space age and the space race between the Soviet Union and United States. Just a month later, Laika, a dog, became the first living creature to orbit the Earth aboard Sputnik 2. Although the poor dog did not survive the mission, this marked the first time a living organism had been sent into space. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to journey into outer space and orbit the Earth, aboard Vostok 1. This monumental achievement solidly established the Soviet Union as a leader in space exploration for the time being. The foundation of Khrushchev's leadership was given in his secret speech, ushering in the era of de-Stalinization. This private speech was given at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 and criticized Stalin's reign of terror, his purges, and his creation of a totalitarian regime. He condemned his predecessor's crimes, particularly the Great Purge, and accused him of betraying Leninist principles. Though it had not been intended for the public, it was leaked to Western media. Khrushchev initiated the rehabilitation of millions of people who had been falsely imprisoned or executed during Stalin's purges. Many political prisoners were released from the Gulag, and repressive laws were eased. While Khrushchev did not entirely remove censorship, there was a relative liberalization in the arts and intellectual life. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other artists were allowed to criticize aspects of Stalinism, though they still had to work within certain ideological boundaries. This was called the Khrushchev thaw, and would extend to the satellite states as well. Displeasure mounted, though, within the Soviet Communist Party, as Khrushchev was seen as a failure both domestically and in foreign policy, including his perceived weakness during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the deterioration of relations with China in the Sino-Soviet split. In 1964, Khrushchev was accused of poor leadership, economic mismanagement, and erratic behavior. Lacking sufficient support within the party, he had little choice but to resign. One of Khrushchev's key opponents was Leonid Brezhnev, who had previously served as one of his protégés and became the new party leader. Brezhnev was more calculating in his governance, knowing his foremost duties were to the party, KGB, and military. This served him well, as he remained leader for 18 years, second only to Stalin himself. To avoid concentration of power, leadership was shared alongside his premier, Alexei Kosygin, and the head of state, Nikolai Podgorny. Brezhnev and Kosygin shifted the focus back to heavy industry and military production, in contrast to his predecessor's emphasis on consumer goods and agriculture. Heavy industry, particularly in sectors like steel, machinery, and energy, continued to receive the lion's share of state investment. One of the most significant early initiatives was the Kosygin reforms, introduced in 1965. The reform allowed individual enterprises greater control over their production decisions and resources. Managers were incentivized to make decisions based on profitability rather than following central plans rigidly. This represented a departure from the Stalinist model of focusing exclusively on production quotas. But by the early 1970s, the reforms faced significant resistance from conservative factions within the Communist Party who viewed them as a threat to central planning. Managers also found it difficult to operate in this system, and the reforms were gradually curtailed. By the late 1970s, much of Kosygin's economic liberalization had been reversed, and Kosygin himself was sidelined by Brezhnev. While Kosygin focused on the economy, Brezhnev focused on political matters. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization process was unpopular, but Brezhnev avoided fully restoring Stalin's cult of personality, though he did actively emphasize Stalin's role as a national hero. While Brezhnev didn't restore a personal dictatorship, he did re-establish a more rigid, authoritarian governance structure that emphasized stability over reform. While Brezhnev's repression was not as brutal as Stalin's, he did move to suppress political dissent, particularly after the Prague Spring of 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Intellectuals, dissidents, and reformists were increasingly targeted for criticizing the regime, and KGB surveillance and control were ramped up. Famous dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn were persecuted under Brezhnev for their criticisms of the Soviet system. In 1973, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was released to Western audiences, providing a deeper look into his experiences in labor camps. He was soon stripped of Soviet citizenship and deported. While the Soviet Union allowed a certain degree of artistic freedom, cultural life became increasingly conservative. Censorship was strictly enforced, and the arts were expected to conform to socialist realism, which glorified Soviet life and the achievements of the working class. Artists were expected to uphold the values of the state, but the style became increasingly formulaic and uninspired by the late 1970s and 1980s, often criticized for its stagnation and lack of creativity. Western ideals, such as Western literature and music, were barred from entering the Soviet Union to avoid the temptations of Western decadence and bourgeois degeneracy. Even when Moscow hosted the 1980 Olympics, the flow of information was controlled going in and out of the country. Many foreign journalists were under surveillance by the KGB, and their communications were likely monitored. From the late 1960s onwards, the Soviet economy began to experience what became known as the era of stagnation. This period was marked by low growth, technological backwardness, and declining productivity in both industry and agriculture. The Soviet Union continued to prioritize the military-industrial complex, which consumed a large portion of the country's resources. The Soviet economy became increasingly reliant on high oil prices during the 1970s, which temporarily masked the deeper structural issues. But this dependence left the economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices. Despite efforts to improve agricultural productivity, the sector remained inefficient. The Soviet Union had to import grain from the West, especially from the United States and Canada, to meet its food needs, an embarrassing development for a superpower. Incentive issues kept productivity per capita lower than in capitalist countries. Quality also suffered, as state-owned factories were only concerned with filling their quotas. In 1975, Brezhnev suffered a stroke, and his health began to deteriorate. Policymaking increasingly became dictated by a new triumvirate. One of these was Yuri Andropov, who ended up succeeding Brezhnev after his death in 1982. Before becoming General Secretary of the Communist Party, Andropov served as the head of the KGB from 1967 to 1982. His long career made him a key figure in Soviet internal security, and he was known for his commitment to protecting the state from both external threats and internal dissent. He was considered a pragmatic leader who sought to address the problems within the Soviet system, but he lacked the time to implement any large-scale changes due to his poor health. He spent much of his time in office in the hospital, and his ability to govern effectively was limited. Despite this, he remained a key figure in Soviet leadership until his death in February 1984. After Andropov's death, the aging and ailing Konstantin Chernenko was chosen to succeed him. Chernenko was seen as a compromise candidate, chosen largely because he represented continuity with the Brezhnev era. Chernenko's leadership style was conservative, and his brief time in power was characterized by a return to many of the old policies. With little inclination toward reform or innovation, this was a continuation of the era of stagnation. The post-war Soviet Union, from the late 1940s to 1980s, experienced a range of social changes. The period was marked by efforts to consolidate the socialist system while also responding to the realities of an increasingly complex and modern society. After the devastation of World War II, the Soviet Union underwent massive reconstruction efforts, especially in cities that had been destroyed during the war, such as Stalingrad and Leningrad. As millions migrated from rural areas, cities expanded dramatically, and industrial centers were rebuilt and developed to support the Soviet economy. The government launched extensive housing programs to meet the growing demand, particularly under Khrushchev. The most iconic of these was the Khrushchevka, mass-produced, prefabricated apartment buildings designed to quickly provide affordable housing. These apartments, though small and often of poor quality, gave millions of Soviet citizens their first private homes. Despite the housing boom, there were still chronic shortages of housing, especially in major cities. During Brezhnev's era, the newer Brezhnevka offered high-rise housing, from 9 to 17 stories. One of the most significant achievements of the Soviet Union was the rapid expansion of education. By the 1960s, the USSR had one of the most literate populations in the world. Education was made free and compulsory for all children, and the state expanded access to higher education. The Soviet government placed a strong emphasis on science, engineering, and technical training, which was essential for supporting the state's industrial and military goals, including the space race and arms development. The Soviet Union officially promoted gender equality, and women were encouraged to participate in the workforce alongside men. Soviet propaganda celebrated the working woman and the role of women in building socialism. While gender equality was promoted in theory, women often faced a double burden of work and domestic responsibilities. Universal healthcare was also provided as a key part of the welfare system. Healthcare was free and accessible to all citizens, and the government prided itself on providing basic medical care to everyone. Public campaigns aimed at limiting diseases like polio and tuberculosis and promoting a healthy lifestyle. Despite universal healthcare, the system struggled with inefficiencies, underfunding, and a lack of modern medical equipment. The state provided a wide range of social benefits, including pensions for the elderly, disability benefits, and support for families with children. These benefits were part of the Soviet social contract, in which the state guaranteed a minimum level of material security in exchange for citizens' political loyalty. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party, succeeding Konstantin Chernenko. Gorbachev, at 54, was relatively young compared to his predecessors and represented a new generation of leadership. His initial goals were to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy and modernize Soviet society without abandoning socialism. He believed the Soviet Union could remain a global superpower, but he recognized that significant reforms were necessary to overcome economic stagnation and corruption. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was Gorbachev's plan to reform the Soviet economy and political system. Introduced in the mid-1980s, it was aimed at decentralizing the economy, allowing for more individual enterprise, and gradually reducing the state's control over economic activity. Gorbachev's reforms allowed for some elements of market economics, including the legalization of small private businesses and cooperatives, which operated alongside state-controlled enterprises. State-owned enterprises were given more independence to make production decisions and retain profits, though they still operated under central planning.
Через демократию вот эту, через советы, через трудовые коллективы, через вот эти вещи все, включения, вот это только путь. К этому надо. Там уже вы, власть в натуре.
Despite these reforms, the economy remained inefficient, and the introduction of market elements led to inflation, shortages of goods, and a decline in living standards. Many industries resisted change, and the transition became chaotic. By the late 1980s, it became clear that Perestroika was not working as intended. The Soviet economy continued to stagnate, and shortages of basic goods worsened, leading to widespread discontent among the population. Glasnost, meaning openness, was Gorbachev's policy of encouraging greater freedom of expression and transparency in government and society. It was designed to reduce the secrecy and corruption that had characterized Soviet governance and to promote public debate about the country's future. Under Glasnost, censorship was reduced, and for the first time, the Soviet press was allowed to criticize the government. Glasnost faced early challenges. An explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant occurred in April 1986, but the Soviet authorities tried to suppress information of the accident. The Soviet government's cover-up began to unravel when Swedish scientists detected unusually high levels of radiation 2 days after the explosion. They traced the source of the radiation to the Soviet Union, forcing Soviet officials to make a public announcement acknowledging the disaster. This resulted in a brief and vague report on the incident.
От Совета министров СССР.
An official announcement from the Council of Ministers. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station. One of the atomic reactors was damaged. The consequences of the accident are being taken care of. Help is being given to the victims of the accident. A government commission has been set up.
This crisis helped fuel demands for greater openness in government and media, and in May, Gorbachev delivered a televised address acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and highlighting the heroism of workers trying to contain the disaster. Newspapers and television programs began covering previously taboo subjects, such as the failures of Soviet agriculture, industrial accidents, and the repression under Stalin. Glasnost led to the rehabilitation of political prisoners and a re-examination of the Stalinist purges and other crimes of the Soviet era. In 1988, Gorbachev introduced a new political structure, including the establishment of a Congress of People's Deputies, an elected body that was intended to create a more democratic and representative government. This was a radical departure from the one-party rule of the Communist Party and allowed for more political pluralism. Gorbachev won an uncontested election within the new Congress to become the first and only president of the Soviet Union, with public elections first set to be held in 1995. Glasnost also unleashed nationalist movements and ethnic tensions in the Soviet republics. Once suppressed under Soviet rule, these movements gained momentum as people began demanding greater autonomy or independence from the USSR. In 1989, Gorbachev made the pivotal decision not to intervene militarily in Eastern Europe as communist regimes faced growing opposition. This led to the collapse of communist governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, marking the end of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's refusal to use force to maintain control over the Warsaw Pact countries was a major factor in the peaceful end of the Cold War. By the end of 1989, nearly all of the Eastern European satellite states had transitioned away from communism. As Glasnost allowed for more open discussion of political and social issues, nationalist movements gained strength in the Soviet republics. Many non-Russian ethnic groups, long marginalized by the centralized Soviet system, began demanding greater autonomy or outright independence. In the late 1980s, nationalist movements in the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia pushed for independence from the Soviet Union. These republics had been forcibly incorporated into the Union during World War II and were the first to declare their intent to secede. Nationalist and ethnic tensions also erupted in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where long-standing grievances between different ethnic groups led to outbreaks of violence and demands for self-determination. Even within Russia, the largest Soviet republic, there was growing dissatisfaction with the Central Soviet government. Under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, the first popularly elected president of Soviet Russia, Russia began asserting its own sovereignty within the USSR, undermining the authority of Gorbachev and the Central Soviet government. By 1991, the Soviet Union was facing an existential crisis. Economic conditions were worsening, nationalist movements were gaining strength, and Gorbachev's authority was increasingly challenged by both reformists and hardliners within the Communist Party. In early 1991, Gorbachev proposed a new Union treaty that would restructure the Soviet Union into a looser confederation of republics. While some republics, including Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, supported the treaty, others, like the Baltic states, rejected it outright and sought full independence. In August 1991, a group of hardline communists and military officials, opposed to Gorbachev's reforms and the new Union Treaty, launched a coup to overthrow him. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and declared a state of emergency, aiming to restore the old Soviet order. The coup failed after 3 days, largely due to Boris Yeltsin's leadership. Yeltsin rallied popular support and military units against the coup, and is most remembered for his famous tank speech. Gorbachev was restored to power, but his authority was deeply weakened, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. The failure of the August coup accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over the following months, more republics declared their independence, and the Central Soviet government lost its remaining authority. By the end of 1991, most of the Soviet republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, had declared independence, leaving the Soviet Union increasingly fragmented. Kazakhstan was the last to break away, remaining the only Soviet republic for a few days.
Мы открылись миру, отказались от вмешательства в чужие дела, от использования войск за пределами страны. И нам ответили доверием, солидарностью и уважением.
On December 25, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, acknowledging that the USSR no longer existed as a unified state. The Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, a loose association of former Soviet republics, was established to manage the transition. Following Gorbachev's resignation, President Yeltsin became the most powerful figure in Russia, marking the beginning of the Russian Federation as an independent state. While the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 signaled the collapse of one of the 20th century's most significant experiments in communism, 1949 marked the beginning of another. On October 1st, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square, Beijing. This marked the formal victory of the CCP over the KMT in the Chinese Civil War, which you can check out last episode. The KMT government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan, where it continued to claim to be the legitimate government as the Republic of China. The CCP's victory ended decades of conflict that had ravaged China, including both the Civil War and the Japanese occupation during World War II. Mao became the chairman of the CCP and the de facto leader of China, overseeing the political and economic direction of the new state. The new government faced immense challenges, including a war-torn economy, social divisions, and infrastructure devastation. The guiding framework for the PRC's initial phase of development was called New Democracy. The core idea was that China would undergo a transitional stage before advancing to full socialism, a unique approach influenced by China's semi-colonial and semi-feudal conditions. New Democracy emphasized an alliance of the major social classes, the proletariat, peasantry, and the petty and national bourgeoisie. Unlike in traditional Marxist theory, which focused on proletarian rule, Mao argued that a broad-based coalition of classes was necessary to achieve modernization and national unity. Under New Democracy, similar to Lenin's New Economic Plan, the CCP would allow limited private enterprise and capitalist development in certain sectors of the economy to help rebuild China's productive forces. One of the most significant and far-reaching policies of the early PRC was land reform. The CCP mobilized peasants to seize land from wealthy landlords, often through struggle sessions, where landlords were publicly denounced and sometimes executed. Land was redistributed to landless or land-poor peasants, creating a new class of small landholders. This policy effectively ended feudal-style landownership in rural China and broke the power of the traditional landlord class, solidifying the CCP's support with the majority of China's population. Socially, these early years aimed at creating a more egalitarian society, like with the marriage law. This was a groundbreaking piece of legislation that outlawed arranged marriages and gave women the right to divorce. Politically, the PRC carried out a campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, targeting former KMT officials, spies, and those seen as threats to the new regime. This was often violent, with tens of thousands executed or imprisoned. To stabilize the economy, the PRC sought to address hyperinflation and restore industrial and agricultural production. The government introduced the renminbi as the new national currency in 1949, replacing various regional currencies and bringing inflation under control. Following the Soviet model, the PRC began to adopt 5-year plans to guide economic development. The first 5-year plan was focused on industrialization and was prepared during the latter years of New Democracy. By 1955, all industries were nationalized and all farmland collectivized, barring smaller personal plots of land. Unlike the Soviets, Mao had forged an organic relationship with the lower classes, so there was little peasant unrest during collectivization. Despite this, industrialization was still not at the levels Mao wanted, and a more radical campaign was launched to meet his goals. This was known as the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was partly driven by Mao's ambition to rapidly surpass Western powers in industrial production. He declared that China should strive to surpass Great Britain in steel production within 15 years. Tensions were growing between China and the Soviet Union over ideological differences and leadership in the communist world, so Mao wanted to demonstrate that China could follow its own revolutionary path. One of the most significant aspects of the Great Leap was the creation of people's communes, which replaced the smaller agricultural cooperatives that had existed since the 1950s. Private land ownership was abolished, and peasants were organized into large communes, some of which had up to 75,000 people. The communes were designed to function as self-sufficient units, overseeing not only agriculture but also small-scale industry, education, and social services. Mao encouraged people across China, particularly in rural areas, to build small backyard furnaces to produce steel. Peasants, factory workers, and even urban residents were diverted from their normal jobs to melt down iron and scrap, along with their household metal objects, to meet ambitious production quotas. In the end, the backyard furnace campaign was a disaster. Most of the steel produced in these furnaces was of such poor quality that it was useless for industrial purposes, and the drive for steel diverted labor away from agriculture and other essential industries. But the Great Leap also sought to dramatically increase agricultural output by introducing untested farming techniques and setting unrealistically high production targets. These ultimately failed as well. The Chinese government adopted some agricultural techniques promoted by Soviet biologist Trofim Lysenko, such as close planting and deep plowing. These scientifically flawed methods caused significant problems by degrading the soil and reducing yields. Local officials, eager to please Mao and meet quotas, often exaggerated production figures when in reality, harvests were far below expectations. The combination of poor agricultural policies, labor being diverted to backyard furnaces, and natural disasters resulted in a total collapse of agricultural production. As part of the Great Leap Forward, the Chinese government launched the Four Pests campaign to eradicate what they considered harmful pests. These were sparrows, rats, flies, and mosquitoes. The rationale behind targeting sparrows was that they consumed seeds, which was believed to reduce crop yields. The mass extermination of sparrows led to a severe ecological imbalance, as locust populations were left to grow, unchecked by their natural avian predator. The increased locust population devastated crops even further. The inflated grain production figures led the government to continue exporting grain and requisitioning food from rural areas, leaving peasants without enough to eat, and by 1959, the country faced severe food shortages. As a result, between 15 and 55 million people are estimated to have died during the Great Chinese Famine from starvation, malnutrition, and related diseases. Migration to urban areas was restricted, leaving millions trapped in rural areas with no access to food. The focus on backyard furnaces and the mobilization of workers for large-scale projects diverted labor away from productive industries, leading to severe shortages of consumer goods and industrial materials. Soviet advisors, who had been helping China develop its industry, were recalled after the Sino-Soviet split, further exacerbating the economic crisis. By 1962, the Great Leap Forward was abandoned by the CCP. Private plots were restored to peasants, and the state retreated from the people's commune system, allowing for more flexibility in agricultural production. The failure significantly damaged Mao's political standing within the party. He remained chairman of the CCP, but ceded much of the decision-making power to senior leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and others. They took control of the economic recovery, implementing more pragmatic policies to address the crisis and restore stability. But Mao was not kept on the sidelines for long. The chairman became increasingly suspicious of Liu, Deng, and other party leaders whom he believed were abandoning the revolutionary goals of communism in favor of capitalist-style policies. Mao feared that the party was becoming corrupt and that the socialist revolution was in danger of being reversed. Fearing remnants of the old feudal and capitalist systems were still embedded in Chinese culture, education, and governance, Mao embraced the concept of permanent revolution, which argued that the struggle to maintain communist ideology must be continuous and unyielding. According to Mao, the key to this was in China's youth. In May 1966, Mao formally launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, calling on the Chinese people, especially the youth, to revolt against the bourgeois elements in society, particularly within the Communist Party and the intellectual and cultural spheres. One of the central features of the Cultural Revolution was the formation of the Red Guards, groups of radical, militant students who responded enthusiastically to Mao's call to defend the revolution. The Red Guard saw themselves as Mao's soldiers, tasked with identifying and attacking anyone perceived as counter-revolutionary or bourgeois. The Red Guards were encouraged to challenge all forms of authority, including teachers, intellectuals, party officials, and even family members. They staged public struggle sessions, where alleged counter-revolutionaries were humiliated, beaten, and forced to confess to crimes against the revolution. Red Guards were responsible for the widespread destruction of China's cultural heritage, including ancient temples, monuments, books, and works of art. Anything associated with the four olds, old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas, was attacked as part of their mission. Liu Shaoqi, once Mao's designated successor, was publicly humiliated, removed from his positions, and subjected to brutal persecution. He was imprisoned and died in 1969 under harsh conditions, while Deng Xiaoping was also purged, but survived. The Cultural Revolution was accompanied by the rise of an intense cult of personality around Mao. The chairman's sayings and quotations were compiled into the Little Red Book, which became a symbol of loyalty to their leader and the revolution. The book was widely distributed and treated almost as a sacred text by the Red Guards and the general population. Mao's image was omnipresent, with his portraits, statues, and slogans dominating public spaces. Reverence for Mao reached a near-religious fervor, with anyone questioning his authority facing severe repercussions. The early years of the revolution were marked by widespread chaos and social upheaval, as millions of people, including intellectuals, scientists, artists, and party officials, were targeted. Many were publicly beaten, tortured, and forced to confess to counter-revolutionary activities. Estimates of the number of deaths range from hundreds of thousands to several million. Schools and universities were closed, as students were encouraged to leave the classroom and join the struggle. Rival Red Guard factions, each claiming to be the true defenders of Mao's vision, began fighting one another. These conflicts often turned violent, leading to armed clashes in cities and towns across China. In many cases, the military was called in to restore order. By 1969, Mao realized that the Cultural Revolution was spiraling out of control. The People's Liberation Army was increasingly used to bring the Red Guards to heel and restore some semblance of order. Mao called for the Red Guards to be disbanded, and millions of urban youths were sent down to the countryside to work on farms and be re-educated by the peasants. While the height of the Cultural Revolution was between 1966 and 1969, its effects persisted throughout the 1970s, with Mao consolidating his power and rival factions within the CCP jockeying for influence. Premier Zhou Enlai played a crucial role in maintaining some stability during the Cultural Revolution. Although loyal to Mao for decades by this point, Zhou Enlai worked to protect many officials from purges and continued to manage China's day-to-day governance. By 1973, Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged during the early stages of the Cultural Revolution, was rehabilitated and brought back into the government as vice premier. In the later years of the discord, a group of radicals, known as the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife, Jiang, rose to prominence, promoting the most extreme aspects of the movement. But on September 9, 1976, Chairman Mao died, and his Cultural Revolution perished alongside him. he was embalmed and remains in a crystal coffin draped in the red flag, sewn with more durable fabric than the brittle social fabric he left behind. Trust in institutions and intellectual values was undermined, and the trauma of the period left a deep and lasting imprint on Chinese society. After Mao's death in 1976, a power struggle ensued between the Maoist hardliners, like the Gang of Four, and the reformers, like Deng Xiaoping. Hua Guofeng, Mao's designated successor, had arrested the Gang of Four, marking the definitive end of the Maoist era. But Hua continued to adhere to Mao's legacy, while Deng advocated for a new direction focused on modernization and reform. Although Hua Guofeng initially assumed power, Deng Xiaoping gradually outmaneuvered him, emerging as China's paramount leader by 1978. He played a key role in steering China away from the radical policies of the Cultural Revolution and was seen as a champion of economic pragmatism. Deng's leadership is best known for the reform and opening up policies that fundamentally transformed China's economy and society. Deng sought to modernize China by introducing market-oriented reforms while maintaining the political dominance of the Communist Party. In the late 1970s, Deng outlined the four modernizations as the key areas where China needed to advance. These were agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. These goals were intended to modernize China's economy and make the country competitive on the global stage. Deng's first major reforms focused on agriculture, where he introduced the household responsibility system. Mao's systems were dismantled, and farmers were allowed to lease land from the state on long-term contracts. Instead of working in large, state-owned collectives, families could work their own plots of land and sell surplus crops in local markets after meeting state production quotas. These reforms significantly boosted agricultural productivity, increased farmers' incomes, and improved living standards in rural areas. State-owned enterprises were granted more autonomy to make decisions based on market demand, rather than central planning. This move aimed to increase efficiency and productivity within the industrial sector. In 1980, Deng established special economic zones in coastal cities like Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen. These zones were designed to attract foreign investment, promote exports, and experiment with capitalist-style market reforms. Foreign companies were given tax incentives, and the SEZs became engines of rapid industrialization and modernization. Under Deng, China began opening its economy to foreign trade and investment. This marked a dramatic shift from the isolationist policies of the Mao era. Deng actively courted foreign investors, especially from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Western countries, leading to the influx of foreign capital and technology. Deng's pragmatic approach to governance led him to introduce the concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics. This allowed for market reforms and elements of capitalism within a socialist framework. He argued that China could adopt market mechanisms to promote economic growth while maintaining the political control of the CCP. Deng Xiaoping's policies led to an era of unprecedented economic growth, which dramatically improved living standards and transformed China into a global economic powerhouse. In the words of a popular countryside saying, "Mao gave us liberation, Deng gave us food." The SEZs became major export hubs, and China's economy grew at an average annual rate of 10% during the 1980s and 1990s. Deng's reforms accelerated urbanization, as millions of rural Chinese moved to cities in search of work in factories and construction. Cities like Shenzhen, which was a small fishing village before 1980, grew into massive metropolises almost overnight. Economic reforms and growth lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. Urban incomes grew rapidly, and consumer goods, such as televisions, refrigerators, and automobiles, became increasingly accessible. While China's economy grew rapidly, the shift toward market-oriented reforms also led to growing income inequality, especially between urban and rural areas. The coastal regions, where the SEZs were concentrated, developed far more rapidly than the inland and western provinces, leading to significant regional disparities. Despite economic reforms, Deng Xiaoping and the CCP maintained tight political control, rejecting calls for democratic reforms or Western-style freedoms. While the state loosened some controls over daily life, it continued to crack down on dissent. To curb China's population growth, which the government viewed as a significant obstacle to economic development, most Chinese families were limited to having only one child. This policy was enforced through promotion of contraception, financial penalties, loss of employment, and in extreme cases, forced sterilizations or abortions. It was widely criticized as an infringement of reproductive rights and led to a significant decline in birth rates, contributing to China's current aging population problems. In the early 1980s, Deng authorized campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization, which targeted intellectuals and others who promoted Western ideas of democracy or individualism. The most significant of these occurred in 1989. In April, a student-led movement in Beijing, advocating for political reform, freedom of speech, and the resignation of the aging Communist Party leadership, led to protests. The movement gained widespread support from students, intellectuals, and urban residents who were frustrated with corruption and the slow pace of political reform. By May, hundreds of thousands of protesters had gathered in Tiananmen Square, Beijing's symbolic political center. The protests coincided with a visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, bringing international attention to the movement. After weeks of negotiations failed to disperse the protesters, Deng Xiaoping and the party leadership authorized the military to clear the square. On June 4, the People's Liberation Army used tanks and armed troops to forcibly suppress the protest. Estimates of the death toll range from several hundred to several thousand. It led to international condemnation, sanctions, and a temporary halt to China's diplomatic relations with Western countries. Domestically, it reaffirmed the CCP's commitment to authoritarian rule and demonstrated that while economic reforms were allowed, political dissent would not be tolerated. After the protests, Deng Xiaoping sought a new leader who could restore stability and preserve Communist Party rule. Deng favored Jiang Zemin, who was then the party secretary of Shanghai. In June 1989, Jiang was appointed General Secretary of the CCP, marking Jiang's entry into the top leadership of China. Although Jiang held the title of General Secretary, his early years in power were marked by a need to consolidate his authority, as Deng Xiaoping and other influential party elders remained the true power brokers. Jiang worked to maintain loyalty to Deng and support the continuation of his economic reform policies. By 1993, Jiang had been elected president and secured his position as chairman of the Central Military Commission, giving him control over the PLA and solidifying his leadership within both the party and the state. Jiang's administration carried forward many of the economic reforms initiated by Deng, particularly those aimed at promoting market-oriented growth while maintaining state control over key sectors of the economy. Jiang advanced the privatization or restructuring of many state-owned enterprises. Thousands of these inefficient or unprofitable enterprises were closed or merged, leading to significant layoffs, but improving the overall efficiency of China's industrial sector. While Jiang maintained the state's dominance in key sectors, such as energy and telecommunications, he also allowed the private sector to expand. By the late 1990s, the private sector had become a significant driver of China's economic growth. Under Jiang's leadership, China embarked on massive infrastructure projects, including the construction of highways, bridges, and the Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest hydroelectric power station. These projects helped fuel urbanization and economic development. Jiang played a key role in promoting China's integration into the global economy and enhancing its role on the international stage. One of Jiang's most significant achievements was China's entry to the World Trade Organization in 2001. This was a major step in China's opening up to international trade and investment. Foreign direct investment surged, and China grew into a global manufacturing powerhouse. While Jiang continued economic liberalization, he maintained strict political control over the country and ensured that the Communist Party remained at the center of China's political system. Any challenges to its authority were suppressed, particularly from pro-democracy movements and the ethnic unrest in Tibet and Xinjiang. One of the most significant internal security actions of Jiang's era was the crackdown on Falun Gong, a spiritual practice that attracted millions of followers. In 1999, the CCP launched a campaign to eradicate the movement, labeling it a heretical organization and arresting thousands of practitioners. Jiang's most important ideological contribution to the CCP was his Three Represents theory, which expanded the role of the party beyond its traditional focus on representing the working class. Jiang articulated that the CCP should represent the development of China's advanced productive forces, the orientation of China's advanced culture, and the fundamental interests of the majority of the Chinese people. A key aspect of the Three Represents was the inclusion of private entrepreneurs and capitalists within the Communist Party. For the first time, business people and members of the emerging middle class were allowed to join the CCP, marking a significant shift from the party's historical identity as the vanguard of the proletariat. Jiang navigated a complex and often tense relationship with the United States, particularly after the Tiananmen Square protests. In the 1990s, he worked to normalize relations with the United States, meeting with US Presidents Bill Clinton and later George W. Bush. But despite improved relations, tensions remained over Taiwan. In 1996, China conducted military exercises near Taiwan in response to the island's first democratic presidential elections, leading to a confrontation with the US. Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 was negotiated under the framework of one country, two systems, a principle that allowed Hong Kong to maintain its capitalist economy and legal system for 50 years after the handover. This framework, designed by Deng Xiaoping, was intended to integrate Hong Kong while preserving its autonomy and economic success. Similarly, Portuguese Macau was handed over to China in 1999 under the same one country, two systems principle. While Jiang Zemin presided over a period of economic prosperity, he also faced significant challenges. The rapid economic growth and decentralization of power under Jiang's leadership led to widespread corruption at all levels of government. Local officials often used their positions to enrich themselves, exacerbating social inequality and public dissatisfaction. It became one of the key issues that would be addressed more aggressively under Jiang's successors. Jiang Zemin stepped down from his formal leadership roles in the early 2000s, marking the end of his era and the beginning of the Hu Jintao administration. Jiang's departure from power was notable for being peaceful and orderly, a sign of growing political stability within the CCP. By the turn of the century, China had become a major player in international trade and was on its way to becoming a global economic superpower, in stark contrast to the long-dissolved Soviet Union. Later, under the leadership of Hu Jintao and later Xi Jinping, China's rapid economic expansion continued, as it remains transformed from the largely agricultural society it had been just a few decades ago, and has redefined itself after the shame of a century of humiliation. And now, it is in a position where its choices will shape not only its own destiny, but the destiny of the entire world.